And so this text is a lot more affirming, and it's fun. It's actually John's Christmas story. And it might not seem like it, but it really is his expression of the coming of Christ in the world. There's already several other Gospels that have been written. The book of Matthew and the book of Luke tell us the details of the Christmas story that most of us know. You know the story of the pregnant virgin Mary and her fiancé and their troubled travels and their visits from adoring magi from the east and shepherds who are out watching their flock by night. It's all about the announcement of angels and the signs of a star in the sky. We get that story of Christmas from the book of Matthew and from the book of Luke. And most of us know that as the Christmas story. Did you realize John has his own Christmas story here? We're going to look at this here in a little bit. But as we think about the Christmas story that we're comfortable with and that we know pretty well, we're really very influenced by this story of Jesus and the manger. Many of us have witnessed Christmas pageants. Have any of you been in New York City and gone to Radio City Music Hall? Seen the Rockettes do their thing? But once they do their high kicking, they always end their show with the scene of the manger and the wise men coming year after year. It never fails. It's a beautiful show. And many people have pageants in their churches. When I got to my church in New Jersey, a woman came up to me and said that she represented the 7th generation of her family that had been a member of that church. That church was older than our church here. And talk about traditions. They had so many traditions, even more than the traditions we have here. And she said to me once, she was our church historian, she said, "This is my daughter." She was 40 years old. And she said, "She's the 8th generation. And here are my grandchildren. They're the 9th generation." And then she pointed to her daughter in her 40s, and she said, "She was baby Jesus." And I said, "You mean in the Christmas pageant?" "Yes." And I said, "That means you must have been Mother Mary." She said, "Yes, I was," with great pride. You know, we know the Christmas story because we've participated in it, haven't we? And I mean, there was this one Christmas pageant years ago where there was this little boy that had to play the role of the innkeeper. You know that role, the one that says, what does the innkeeper say to Joseph when he says, "Is there room in your inn?" What does he say? No room in the inn. Well, this boy had this responsibility. He had to say, "There's no room in the inn." And so here comes the knock from Joseph, and they practiced it over and over. And the knock would come from Joseph. "Is there room in the inn?" And the innkeeper, he would say, "Sure, come on in, plenty of room." And no matter what they did to practice, he could not send the Holy Family away. They moved him to be a wise man instead. Fitting responsibility. And they got a mean boy to play the role of the innkeeper. And they practiced. The mean boy practiced his responsibility, and when Joseph knocked, he said, "There's no room in the inn." And so the night of the performance came, and Joseph knocks, and he says, "There's no room in the inn." And he sees the sad Holy Family walking away, and he says, "You should have booked in advance." We know the Christmas story. We might get it a little confused, right? We do get it a bit confused, but we know it. We've participated in it. And we have songs based on the story that is shared with us in Matthew and in Luke. Songs like, "Away in a manger, no crib for a bed." You know, ready? And then we also have, "Hark the herald angels sing." And then what's that one that was sung in the one pageant? "While shepherds watched their socks at night." We know the story, right? We sing about it, but we get it a little bit confused. But we basically know the story, and we have our traditions based upon the Christmas story in Matthew and Luke. You know, some of us might put a little sign in our yard that says, "Happy Birthday, Jesus." We'll put a bumper sticker. Someone was giving out signs last year. I think it was Don Needham gave a bunch of signs to people. And people put those "Happy Birthday, Jesus" signs in their yards. I know some of you will have Christmas creches, and then you wait until Christmas Day and you bring out the little baby Jesus and you put it out in the little manger. In our house, my wife makes a Jesus bread. Any of you have Jesus bread? I think it's a unique tradition in my family. It's a Jesus bread in swaddling clothes. And it looks like baby Jesus. And we put 3 little candles on as a halo around the baby Jesus. And we sing, "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to Jesus." And that's a tradition in our family. So we have these traditions in our families, but so much of these traditions are based on this story from Matthew and Luke. But here comes John, and there is no Virgin Mary in his story, no angels, no visiting magi, there's no visiting shepherds, but his story of the birth of Jesus is a highly philosophical and theoretical story. But it has profound depth for the people of the 1st and 2nd century to whom he writes. He says this, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And that was Jesus. Now, John is talking to the intellectual, philosophical needs and organizing principles that directed the thinking of the people around him in his day. And his words spoke to Jews and to Greeks alike. To the Jews, they had in their very opening book of the Bible in Genesis these words, "In the beginning," remember? In the beginning, God did what? Created the heavens and the earth. And what did God do? He said, "Let there be." And what happened? There was light. God spoke, and it happened. And what John is telling the Jews who were directed by the scriptures of the Hebrew Old Testament, he's saying, you know this God who spoke in the past, who communicated himself by speaking creation into existence? That God who was creating in the very beginning is still creating and doing something new today, and he has spoke to us through Jesus. That word is logos. And when Greek scholars took the Hebrew scriptures down in Alexandria in Egypt, and they translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, they translated that word, that term for word, about 300 different times and into the word logos. And that's the word that John uses here. And for the Hebrew people, the word was not just the word that God spoke, but the word had to do with the character of God, how God communicates God's self, how God has wisdom and how God has reason. The very essence of God is expressed in that word, logos. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, in the Septuagint translation of Scripture, we're told that logos is wisdom that walks the street and seeks to communicate to us. And John tells us the logos has become flesh and dwelt among us. That's his Christmas story. And for the Greeks, this concept of logos also had profound meaning. About 600 years before John wrote from the city of Ephesus, and they think that he wrote from the city of Ephesus. Irenaeus, the early church father in 150 AD, said that John went to Ephesus. And if you go to Ephesus in Turkey today, the Turks will tell you John was there. They'll even show you the house of Mary. And who knows whether that was the house of Mary, but they say that John took Mary there because Jesus had commended his mother into John's care. And if you're there in Ephesus, where John was writing, not only was there an enclave of Jews, but there was a dominant amount of Greek thinkers in this real metropolitan city of the ancient world. And the shadow of the philosopher Heracles loomed large in this city. Do you know the philosopher Heracles? He preceded Aristotle and Plato. And he's the one that taught that the world is constantly in flux and is always changing. And you probably heard about Heracles and maybe in an introduction to philosophy class, or perhaps you've just heard this story somewhere. He's the one that told the story of taking your foot and putting it into a river and then lifting it out. And then if you put your foot back in the river, it's a different river that you put it in. Remember hearing that story? That's an illustration of the flux of the world. And Heracles was talking about this flux in the world, that everything is changing, and people would ask him, then how in the world is anything held together? And what he taught that the world is held together by the very essence and reason and word of the divine. He used the word logos. Heracles also taught not only is the world held together, situations, but he also taught that our very morality, what Immanuel Kant called that moral imperative that seems to guide us in our thinking. Well, Heracles was talking about the very ability to determine goodness and rightness is something that God has, and it is in the world guiding, and that essence is what he called the logos. And John tells us in his book that the logos became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He's inviting us to use our heads. And he's inviting us to think about what are the philosophical principles that guide our thinking, that guide and orient our actions. How do we construct our days? How do we make the decisions that we make? What do we think about the world we live in? And he's inviting us to consider Jesus. Because in the beginning, there was wisdom, reason, word, logos. And that beautiful thing has become real, fleshly. It's with us. Now, I have a friend that I sit coffee with on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Sometimes when I don't want to talk and when I have a lot of things to do, I don't go to the same coffee shop he's at. He's a philosopher, went to a Catholic school, and I think it was a Jesuit school. Those guys teach kids to think. But unfortunately, he doesn't go to church and isn't a part of a Christian community. Maybe he'll come here. Who knows? But he told me one day, he saw these signs saying, "Happy birthday, Jesus." And he says, that's silly. People just domesticating Jesus to their own needs. And I said, well, it could be that they're celebrating the incarnate reality of something very profound that has come into the world. And he says, I doubt it. I doubt it. And I said, well, that's what I celebrate. And that's certainly what John was celebrating when he talked about his Christmas story. He was talking about God doing something in the world that's new, that's fresh, that's here, and it's now. And that's what Jesus brings. And what Jesus brought to John's life was so utterly profound that later on in the text, which he tells story after story about people having to grapple with who is Jesus and what difference does he make in my life? Who is Jesus and what difference does he make in my life? It comes to chapter 13 in the book of John, and they're sitting here at the Last Supper. And when they're sitting at the table of the Last Supper, John tells us that he was laying up against the bosom of Jesus. It was there at that supper that Judas betrayed Jesus. But John wanted us to know that he who was in the bosom of the Father is someone that he wanted to lean into the bosom of. And that's really our invitation as we come to this meal. This is a very religious kind of thing here, folks. And if you're new with us, we got these symbols here before us that seem like maybe just a bunch of religious rigmarole, and it's not. We're talking about ultimate reality here. And we're talking about an invitation that comes to us from the history of Jesus' life and those that knew him. This man, John, said Jesus made a profound difference in his life. And what we do when we share this meal together, just as Jesus shared a meal together with his disciples long ago, what we do is we say, you know what, we want to lay back into what is really real and true and right. And so I would invite you today, if that's something that you would like during this Christmas season, not just to domesticate Jesus and to look at him in a manger and just sing sweet little songs and laugh at sweet little things and decorate trees, but if you really are open here as we begin the Advent season to leaning back into ultimate reality and embracing ultimate reality together in Christian community, I'd invite you to share in this meal. It's open to everybody. If you would take these elements and receive them, know that Jesus, the very Spirit of Jesus, is still at work in this world, and he's at work in you. As we come to this meal, I would invite you to share together these words of confession that are in your bulletin. These are ancient words that Christians declared together, describing their hope and their faith, and I invite you to read them together with us as we think about what God is up to in our world today. Would you stand together with me?